I hear this boom. I remember hearing this loud boom. A kind of boom that echoes throughout the entire psych ward. It was an hour into my shift. All of us working that day, all of the patients hear this sound. So we spring up and like ants, we are scattering around the psych ward, trying to find the source of this sound. And as a nurse, given the loudness of the sound and how much it echoes throughout our unit, my hunch is that a patient has probably fallen. I'm really hoping that's not the case, but I'm also thinking that that's probably what happened. So let me describe the layout of our psych ward because it's rather odd. There's a nursing station in the center. Then you have a staff station in front of our nursing station. Then you have one long hallway going this way, a shorter hallway in the middle, and then another short hallway on the right. And then a day hall behind you. So it kind of looks like this entire picture here. There's just a lot of different places the boom could have come from. And when we all heard it, it was so loud and so full of bass, none of us knew which direction it came from. So we're scattering around, trying to find where this noise came from. And it felt like probably a minute had passed by, but in reality, it was probably more like 20 seconds. And then all of a sudden, I hear a female coworker yell out, "Nick, I need your help." And just from the sound of her voice, I get these goosebumps from just sort of the desperate sincerity in her tone, and from its urgency, my heart starts racing, and I'm thinking, oh shit, what am I going to see when I get in there? The same coworker who had yelled for help is standing outside of our laundry room. And when I turn the corner to peek inside the laundry room, I see this large woman, one of our patients, flat on her back. She's about, I'd say she was probably 5'10", 230 pounds or so. And although her BMI would indicate her as obese, I would say she was more Amazonian in nature, kind of big boned and a little heavy set. And if I had to guess her age, I would say she was probably in her late 50s. So she's flat on her back. And when I look at her face, it's completely pale. It's just like a ghost. Her lips are blue, she appears unconscious, and she's gurgling with mucus and what kind of looks like dark blood coming out of her mouth. And inside her nostrils, I can see what appears to be dried blood, although it's suspicious. It looks almost like a little too dark to be blood. So I immediately tell my coworker to call 911. I go into this small room. It's oval shaped. It's a laundry room. You know, we got a washer and dryer in there. On the floor itself, on this rectangular part of the floor, it's probably no more than 7 feet by 3 feet, and it just feels really crammed. Plus, her body's on the same floor, so there's not a whole lot of room. So I tell another coworker to grab some pillows, and I roll this patient onto her left side. At this point, I'm thinking, God, I hope this gurgling sound goes away, and this mix of mucus and blood starts to come out of her mouth, because I can tell she's low on oxygen. So instantly, as soon as I roll her to her side, she starts coughing up more mucus, and I can see it coming out of her mouth. The color to her face returns, her lips aren't blue anymore, but I notice her breathing is very labored, and she's gasping for air every time she inhales, and every time she would inhale, it appeared a little bit of mucus would come into her mouth. And so I remember feeling so anxious at this point. I was like, okay, I'm gonna have a freaking patient right here on the floor die right in front of me because she's going to asphyxiate on her own mucus. So I look over my shoulder, and I don't know why. I just looked over my shoulder, and I happened to notice one of my coworkers standing there, and he's looking down at us, staring down at us, and he's just like a deer in headlights look. I can tell he's thinking, holy shit, what's going on? And he looks completely dazed. So I ask him if the ambulance has been called. He says it has. Then I look back down at our patient, and there's still some residual mucus in her mouth. Hey, by the way, we're about halfway through the story. If you've made it this far, please give this video a thumbs up, and I would love to have you as a subscriber if you already aren't. All right, so there's this residual mucus in her mouth, and I wish like at the state hospital we had one of those Yonker things, and I wish we had one of those Yonker devices or those suction devices, whatever they're called, because it would have been so nice in this situation knowing that I could have just turned it on and just sucked everything out. And I know in nursing school, and for those of you nurses out there, you can probably relate to this, but they always tell you never to reach inside a patient's mouth when they're potentially seizing. But I ain't gonna lie, there was a part of me that absolutely wanted to, and I was just like, I was thinking I could do it quickly. I could just swipe my finger real quick and probably clear a lot of the sputum from her mouth. But then I was like, okay, wait, don't do that. Don't be an idiot. Don't lose a finger. You might get bit. But at the same time, I didn't want her to asphyxiate on this sputum because she was still taking these gasping breaths, and as she's inhaling, I could hear and I could see her suck back in some of that sputum. So instead of foolishly reaching into her mouth, I just kind of grabbed the back of her head and the back of her hair, and I turned her head sort of towards the floor so that more of the mucus would come out. And this actually seemed to work. I also remember trying to time the seizure with my cell phone after I got her into the recovery position. Of course, as I later found out, I must have forgotten to press a button or something, because when I unlocked my phone, I just saw the blank screen of my stopwatch. But even if I had my phone on, I think it would have been very difficult to time the seizure precisely, because it was hard for me to tell when exactly the seizure had stopped, because she kind of came in and out of consciousness. So anyhow, I've got her fairly stable on her side in the recovery position. My coworker comes back with a pillow. I put that pillow under her head, and she wasn't thrashing about. Oftentimes when we think of seizures, of people having seizures, we think of people violently and uncontrollably thrashing about like a fish that's out of water. She wasn't like that at all. But what if that starts to happen? Like, what if she all of a sudden starts thrashing about? How are we going to protect her head? So I just wanted to have like a lot of pillows surrounding her head in case that happened. That was kind of my next concern. I just want to keep her safe in that position and make sure her head was supported by a ton of fluffy pillows. And as I'm talking about this, one thing that was weird is that even though she wasn't thrashing around, she would try to roll back onto her back occasionally. And I'm pretty good at stabilizing people in this recovery position, because I used to do a lot of jujitsu, and I had a pretty good grip on her pant leg, on her right pant leg, and on her tricep. So her arm was kind of thrown across like this. So I'm gripping back here, her left arm with my left hand, and then her right leg, I'm grabbing kind of the outside, the lateral aspect of her right knee, and I'm holding her like this, so she can't roll to her back this way. But because she's a bigger woman, I feel like I'm having to use quite a bit of strength to keep her in this position as she attempts to roll to her back. So eventually she starts to regain consciousness, and I can tell she's confused, and she goes to sit up by posting on her left arm, and that's the arm that's closest to the ground. And you see this in MMA all the time. It's how guys get up from the ground when someone else is on top of them. And what the guy in the dominant position, the guy on top, will do is he will squeeze that arm that they're posting. He will kind of give it a bear hug and then shove them back down to the ground. And it works all the time, but I can't do this because it's completely unsafe. And if I were to do that, she might hit her head. At the same time, I don't want her to stand up. She's a bigger gal. She has a lot of strength. And I'm worried what's going to happen is she's going to stand up, and she's so confused, so dazed, so out of it. She's just getting out of the seizure that when she goes to stand up, she's going to fall again and hit her head. And I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to assist that fall in a very safe manner. Or she might just stand up and become combative. I mean, who knows? Seizures, I feel like, are very unpredictable. Plus, something else I noticed is she happened to be covered in a lot of her own fecal matter. And what I noticed is when I initially placed her in the recovery position, there was fecal matter smeared all over the posterior side of her body. So the reality is she probably smeared a lot of that fecal matter over her. Hands were probably covered in feces. I didn't want her getting up, becoming combative potentially, and touching any one of us with her hands that were covered in feces. So my goal at this point was to just reassure her. I was like, Kim, not a real name, of course. You're fine. You just had a seizure. You're really safe. Just lie back down. And I would just continue to say this while applying some pressure to her upper body to encourage her to lie back down. So at this point, she would go from lying back down to sitting back up to lying back down to sitting back up. And it got very hard for me to get her to lie back down at one point. I just don't think she really wanted to do that. And so I was like, okay, she definitely cannot stand, at least until the paramedics arrive. So I just kept reassuring her. I was putting quite a bit of weight on her shoulders so she would be less likely to stand. And luckily, right around this point, the paramedics arrived. And I felt like it seemed like forever, but it probably was maybe only 7 minutes, which I guess does sort of seem like forever when you're sitting there trying to stabilize a patient. So the paramedics arrive, they get there, they help us get her in the stretcher, and then they transport her to the hospital. So the backstory with our patient here is she's diagnosed with schizophrenia. She's often delusional at times. Sometimes you could have a coherent conversation with her, although her responses were often delayed and she presented as somewhat confused. When I did her initial intake, she would tell me things like, oh, I've got all these cuts on my arms, and she would show me her arms, and then there would be no cuts there whatsoever. She had a pretty flat affect, although sometimes it could be congruent to the conversation, but a little delayed and less expressive than we might otherwise expect. Now, here's the curious thing about Kim. She did have a seizure disorder. She had a history of seizures. She was on Keppra 500 milligrams twice a day, which is an anticonvulsant medication that helps prevent seizures. But 2 to 3 days prior to the seizure, she had been admitted to a local hospital. And I can't remember the reason we had sent her out to the hospital. I hadn't worked that day, but they had done some blood work, and on her blood work, it showed that her sodium levels were within normal limits. I think they were 137, and typically normal sodium limits are anything between 135 and 145. When these numbers start dropping below 135, you might start to see some changes in behavior, altered mental status, confusion, things like that. What's interesting in Kim's case is that when we sent her to the hospital after she seized and they did some blood work, her sodium was 118. So in about 2 days, somehow her sodium had dropped from 137 to 118. I found an article on PubMed that says severe hyponatremia, which is low sodium in hospitalized patients, has a high mortality rate. Mortality rates in hospitalized patients rise above 10% for patients with sodium of 120 to 124. Then the trend reverses once the sodium drops below 120. So presumably her sodium was at one point between 120 to 124. It's not that it could have just dropped from like 135 to 118 without going through that range, right? Meaning that at one point she had a very high chance of dying. At least in my personal opinion, I think having a 10% chance of death is pretty high. Luckily for our patient, she ended up okay. A few days after the incident, I called the nurse at the local hospital, and the way she described Kim's behavior suggested to me that Kim was back at her baseline mental functioning. The curious part is, how did her sodium go from 137 to 118 in a matter of days? What changed in those days? A few staff reported seeing her drink an excessive amount of water on the unit. Kim had been taking an SSRI to treat her depression. SSRIs like Zoloft and Prozac. I can't exactly remember the SSRI she was on, but those can be associated with excessive water intake. There's also a condition called psychogenic polydipsia, a condition characterized by excessive fluid intake in the absence of psychological stimuli to drink. Someone with psychogenic polydipsia will volitionally drink more water than their body actually requires for adequate functioning. Psychogenic polydipsia is common in people with chronic mental illness, especially in schizophrenia. And of course, if you remember, schizophrenia was one of the mental diagnoses our patient had. Additionally, a few days prior to her seizure, she had also been prescribed a diuretic that potentially depleted her sodium as well. And her diuretic may have made her feel dehydrated, encouraging her to drink more water than perhaps she needed. So there may have been, I guess my point is, there may have been a number of factors that potentially contributed to her hyponatremia. Number one, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and those diagnosed with schizophrenia may drink more than their body actually needs. Number two, she was taking an SSRI, which may have caused the psychogenic polydipsia, contributing to her excessive water intake. And number three, she was recently prescribed a diuretic, which may have depleted her sodium as well. These three factors may have contributed to her hyponatremia, and her hyponatremia may have caused her seizure. Then again, even that's difficult to say because she did have a history of seizures, so this all could have been coincidental, but I doubt it. Or it could have been a combination of her hyponatremia plus her history of seizures. Maybe just the two of them together is what caused her to seize. The good news is Kim made it out well and alive. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you on our next video. Bye.